Great. Let's get started. Welcome everyone. It's super rainy here in Amsterdam, so it's a great day for attending the Hot Politics Lab again. I want to welcome our speaker today, Danna Young from the University of Delaware. She's a professor of communication science, and in the departments of communication and political science. I see now I'm clearing my screen, so automatically corrected. It's really great to have you, Danna. I think I've been following you on Twitter for 2 years. And it's been very nice, and it's nice to finally really, well, I won't say really meet you, but it's to really meet you.
Sort of meet.
Sort of meet online. Danna has done extensive work on political communication, development of political beliefs, and the differences between liberals and conservatives regarding their political beliefs. And she has an impressive amount of media appearances. She has a TED Talk that has been listened to 1.5 million times. I think you must be our most popular speaker so far in TV.
Wow, but you're setting a high bar. Do you know how this is supposed to work?
It's an honor to have you here. So for those of you new here today, Danna will talk for about 25 minutes. Then there is the opportunity to ask questions. And if you're online, you can ask your questions in the Q&A box. And Isabella Robasso here to the left of me will then moderate the discussion. If you're here in the room, you can just ask your question by raising your hand. For now, I'll just yield the floor to you, Danna.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. This is very exciting because this is the first time that my new work has sort of seen the light of day. So I'm really eager to get some feedback. Let me just give you a sense of what it is I have been working on. There has been a lot of work in the misinformation space, which I think is dominating the field of political communication right now. And a lot of that work is dealing on the side of the content of misinformation itself, asking questions about the efficacy of content moderation and belief correction, and Penny Cook and Rand's work on the accuracy prompts. And it really got me thinking about whether or not it made sense for us to just be so focused on the supply side of misinformation when so much of misinformation is about demand. We may not even know it, but that is what the misinformation crisis is right now. And because I'm an Americanist, this is really focused on the US context, but I think that the broader themes that I'll be addressing extend across. They are generalizable, especially to broader conversations about conservative populist movements. What I have tried to do in my new book project is put together a really cohesive framework for regular people to understand what is going on. And my hope is that with this framework, there will be, it'll offer some insights to allow scholars to test some of the empirical propositions within it. I guess my sense was that in the US right now, there's so much divisiveness, there's so much chaos, and there's so many different sources of this chaos that it can feel completely out of control and unfixable. And I really started thinking about how all of these processes are operating synergistically. And if we think about them as such, we may be better equipped to address them. So that's what I'm going to, it's big. This is a 30,000-foot view today. So, and I really do encourage you to challenge some of these assertions. Some of them will also be things that we already know, but hopefully tied together in a new way that you might find useful. So what I'm going to do today is talk broadly about human sense making, the role of social identity in the process of human sense making. I'll give some background on the US context in particular with polarization and the social sorting of the political parties. What happened here? There we go. Then I'm going to tap into a concept that I'm considering calling epistemic identity, which is an overlapping concept with partisan identity, especially in the United States. That is how we come to know the things we know is increasingly embedded in who we think we are and what team we're on. I'm going to tackle the fact that this is an asymmetrical phenomenon that's happening in the United States. The sorting of the parties itself is asymmetrical, and the consequences of that are also asymmetrical. And then I'll present the model that I'm calling political identity distillation, which I hope you enjoy. Okay, so let's go for the ride, shall we? When we think about the misinformation crisis, really what we have to think about moving backwards is, how do people make sense of their worlds? How do we make sense of the world around us? And this is a question that philosophers have been asking for centuries. And it kind of boils down to the interaction of two different origins of knowledge, right? There's the underlying theories, values, and beliefs that we hold, and there's the observations of the world that we make. And these are in this delicate dance together, where our observations of the world inform the theories, values, and beliefs we hold, but also the theories, values, and beliefs we hold shape the observations that we make. And therein lies the rub, right? Because observations are not theory neutral. And as a result, we have, by default, a confirmation bias, right? We have a reinforcement effect that is just the human tendency. And part of that is really because observations are theory laden. We do not experience the world in a neutral way. So this kind of invites a question then: if that's the issue, then where do our theories, values, and beliefs come from in the first place? Unfortunately, part of that comes from the observations that we're already making that are rooted in those underlying theories from the start. So that's not going to get us closer to truth. So where are other sources of those underlying theories, values, and beliefs? And here I have found the role of social identity so helpful, because social identity shapes our theories, values, and beliefs. That is the team that we're on. The norms of our social categorization, the norms of our group, are going to shape what we believe, what we value, and our theories about the world. But, and this is what's super fascinating, right, is that our social identity is also going to literally shape what we see. What team we're on, what social identity is salient at a given moment is going to shape the very essence of the observations that we make. We will experience the world differently based on what team hat we feel that we are wearing. I also am going to spend time today talking about how the dance between these two vectors, right? The effects of our underlying beliefs on our observations and the effects of our observations on the updating of beliefs. That dance itself is affected by social identity. And that's the epistemic identity piece that I'll be talking about. So not only does social identity shape both of these, it shapes the interplay between them. And all of these, again, it result in a reinforcement effect, but here it's the reinforcement of that social identity that is guiding these processes from the start. And as I said, the relative influence of these two causal arrows varies, whether it is more likely that your theories will shape your observations rather, or your observations will tend to update your beliefs. And this matters in terms of our susceptibility to misinformation. And there's just such a huge amount of work in this area. The relationship between how we come to make sense of our worlds, whether it be guided by our pre-existing beliefs and theories and values, or guided by the role of new observations and evidence. So you can think about this in terms of epistemic beliefs. I've been thinking about it in terms of epistemic motivations. That is, the motivations that we have to make sense of the world in different ways. So the folks who prioritize intuition and emotion will tend to engage with the world one way, and the folks who prioritize evidence and data will tend to engage with the world another way. So let's think about that in terms of the dynamics I outlined from the start. Those folks who are prioritizing intuition and emotion and sort of gut-based thinking, they are going to tend to privilege their pre-existing theories, values, and beliefs in shaping the observations they make. Whereas those folks who tend to value evidence and data, they're going to tend to put more weight on the observations of the world that they make in updating their theories, values, and beliefs. So this is going to kind of reduce that reinforcement effect that tends to be our default. This matters because epistemic motivations are closely tied to belief in misinformation, which makes sense if you're thinking about the extent to which our new observations are updating our values, theories, and beliefs. We know from Garrett and Weeks that people who value intuition and emotions are more likely to hold sort of general conspiracy theory beliefs, and they're more likely to believe misinformation about issues and events. We know that thoughtful reflection, that is a combination of a high need for cognition and a low need for affect, is associated with a reduction in misperceptions. We also know that actively open-minded thinking, right? That is privileging the incoming information, being open to new information rather than prioritizing the things you already hold and carry with you. Actively open-minded thinking is also associated with a reduction in conspiracy theory beliefs. Great. Well, shit. What happens when these epistemic motivations themselves become embedded within my social identity? What happens when part of being on my team is making sense of the world in this way? And unfortunately, it seems that's exactly what's happening in the United States. So I'm going to go very quickly because it's just a lot. It's super depressing too. So why depress you? It's where I am right now, it's morning. So, and it's Friday. Why would I get too depressed? You may have heard the United States has an ideological polarization problem at the level of elites. You may also have heard that we have an affective polarization problem where members of each of the political parties hate members of the other party. Perhaps you've heard about Liliana Mason's work on the social sorting of the parties, where the parties have become the two. Remember, there's two political parties. That's all we get. The sorting of the parties has happened along these racial, religious, and cultural lines, leaving Republicans as the party of white, Christian, rural Americans, and the Democrats, the party of a more diverse, more secular, and slightly more urban contingency. The religious sorting that is at the heart of this sort of sorting of evangelical Christians and the deliberate courting of evangelical Christians into the Republican Party in the 1970s really has contributed to very fundamentally different ways of understanding the world that are overlapping with political party. So you may be familiar with the work of Oliver and Wood, where they talk about the divide between the intuitionists and the rationalists. And this is what I'm referring to as the epistemic sorting of the parties. So what happens when our way of coming to truth, whether through intuition and emotion or through evidence and data, is itself embedded within our social identity? Well, it's not good. Let me show you, actually, this is the model of what should happen if part of your social identity is that you privilege and value evidence and data. You engage, your team engages in actively open-minded thinking, right? That's something that you value, and it's part of your team's norms. What should happen then is that your observations will tend to be more likely to update the theories, values, and beliefs that you hold. So you'll be more open to change. That is going to result in a limited reinforcement effect for your social identity. And this is what we're seeing on the side of the Democratic Party in the US right now. In fact, there's associations here also with trust in institutions and science. So trust in the institutions that share this epistemic value system, which also is tied into social identity. So what happens on the other side? What happens if part of your social identity, your team, is privileging intuition and emotion? Well, here, this is the perfect recipe for reinforcement. It's also the perfect recipe for rampant misinformation, where your pre-existing theories, values, and beliefs are going to shape what you seek out, the observations that you try to make, the way that you interpret the things that you see, all of which are going to be prone to reinforce your social identity anyhow. And because you're doing it through the lens of sort of gut-guided, instinct-driven sense-making, that process is fueled even more. And this is what I am arguing that we are seeing in the American conservative movement, which embodies this spirit of populism, this dominance of gut-guided sense-making. Now, we also know that gut-guided sense-making is associated with authoritarianism. It is so associated with conservative populism. So even though I'm an Americanist, I do think that there's concepts here that we can extend beyond this framework. So what does this mean for the politics of misinformation? Well, here's a hint, it's not good. So here, the only data I'm going to show to you today, because I'm doing this sort of theory piece, comes from a pair of surveys that were run in the fall of 2020, right after the 2020 election. And there's two data sets. One is for younger folks, ages 18 to 49, and the other is ages 50 plus. And what I'm showing you here, if you look at the top, these top two graphs, these are the number of COVID misperceptions as a function of political party, split out by epistemic motivations driven by intuition and emotions. So you'll notice that what we have is that for people, regardless of party, for people who do not place a lot of value in intuitions and emotions, their number of COVID misperceptions of these three, and I can talk to you about what those items are after if you'd like, their total number of misperceptions is quite low, and it goes up as their faith, the faith that they place in intuition and emotions also goes up. Now, we should be a little bit comforted by the fact that in the older sample, because literally there was an imminent threat of death of COVID, we do not find this dynamic to be as strong, which I think that to me says there are inroads to be made here and reality can actually matter. The bottom two, these are the number of election misperceptions. This is things like there was widespread voter fraud, Joe Biden did not win the election. All of these are demonstrably false. Again, we see not just a relationship with political party, but amplified by these epistemic beliefs. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, as Stephen Colbert said, reality has a well-known liberal bias, and perhaps this is why. Part of this is about the asymmetry of what has gone on within in the dynamics of social sorting of the two political parties. So when I think about the process of social sorting that Mason outlines, I like Venn diagrams. So I think about it this way, that we all have different identities, right? There's my political identity, cultural identity, racial identity, religious identity, geographic identity. As time has gone on, and for various reasons related to polarization and behavior of elites, we have witnessed these categories increasingly overlap. And so, you know, you have these so many Americans who check all the boxes, especially on the right. And that is crucial because partisan identity salience, whatever social identity that's going to guide how you see the world, is contingent on fit. How well do you fit in your category? How well do you think you fit? How well do you think members of the other side fit in their category? And when we have aligned racial, religious, geographic, and cultural categories, we have very good fit, exceptional fit, especially on the right, where these categories are homogenous, right? Ezra Klein wrote in his book, you know, while the Republican Party has become the party of sameness, the Democratic Party has become the party of difference. And so to the extent that these identity-driven dynamics are what are driving these processes, we are going to see this as an asymmetrical phenomenon, at least in the US context. Whoops, there. All right, in case you didn't know what that meant, white, Christian, rural, traditional. So how does this become institutionalized? There's a wonderful new concept that Dan Kreis, Shannon McGregor, and Regina Lawrence have introduced us to based on the concept of issue ownership. They extend that to identity ownership, that political elites are cognizant of what is going on with this social sorting. And so they're engaged in the performance of identity ownership. They're trying to show that they're a good group prototype. They're a good fit with the group's characteristics, values, and norms. This is also crucial because the primacy of social identity heightens the salience of outgroup threat every day. And that's something that cultural conservatives are already attuned to. Anyhow, it also rewards elites who aggressively perform group protective strategies, right? So at the Supreme Court nomination hearings for Judge Jackson, Ted Cruz infamously asked 1,000 questions about critical race theory, including the existence of racist baby books in the school on which Judge Jackson serves as a board member. The bonus here, and the reason that these processes are synergistic, is that these performances are compatible with the press biases that already exist. Press biases in favor of personality, right? So that performance works, conflict, so tapping into intergroup threat works, and fragmented events. So having these moments, these dramatic displays appeals to existing press biases. We also have this asymmetrical phenomenon where the media dynamics themselves that are rooted in identity reinforcement are lopsided. Remember at the beginning when I talked about how observations are one of the things we use to inform our theory, values, and beliefs, but those observations are not made in a vacuum. Well, media themselves provide some of those observations of the world, right? This is Bandura back decades. Media provide a piece of the observations that we use to update what we believe to be true. In the context of our current media environment, we have partisan media and social media, and that's what I'm going to address here. Because of fragmented media economics, the system encourages the development of distinct content for distinct audiences, okay? Not just in terms of the content or the partisanship, but in terms of the tone and even the aesthetics of those messages. So media products are tapping into our social identities, anticipating what it is that our social identities are going to demand and giving us what they think we want. And catering to partisan mega identities does this super efficiently. And what we're finding is that some of these programs are being driven by data analytics, which is really fueling this even more. In fact, there's an amazing piece in the New York Times about Tucker Carlson and the fact that his content minute to minute is driven by data analytics. And it's about emotional responses from viewers, and it's about identity reinforcement and identity threat. On the other hand, our social media sources embed the information that we receive within a social context. So again, now we have the encouragement of the performance of identity, but instead of elites who are being encouraged, now it's regular people who are being encouraged, right? To show that they are a good group prototype, performing the role of someone within that category. Where do I want to go here? I'm cognizant of the time. Okay, so both of these processes reward emotional, identity threatening, and identity reinforcing posts on social media or engagement with partisan media through these data analytics and engagement metrics. All of this is priming our social identities, but it also is providing us with observations that then will contribute to the reinforcement and distillation of those identities in the future. So I don't know if we have any whiskey drinkers in the room, but
not right now.
Not right now, okay. What do you mean? It's Friday, it's 3 p.m.
After your talk.
Okay, so distillation is the process of purifying whiskey, right? You heat it, it becomes a gas, you cool it, and then it condenses. And then you take the drops of alcohol that have resulted from that, and you run through it again. So really expensive whiskey has been distilled maybe twice or 3 times. That is exactly the process that we are witnessing with our social identity. It is tapping into these sources are tapping into our social identity, anticipating our social identity, delivering us observations that we can then make to update that social identity. And this is what this looks like in my little mind, okay? This is how I think that this operates. You have political elites anticipating who we think we are and how people like us make sense of the world, right? Think about Trump saying that his gut tells him more than any expert could ever tell him. That is epistemic identity reinforcement, right? Now, so what does he do? He then creates those messages about gut-guided thinking, etc., that then serve as the observations that we can use to make sense of our world. Same is true of partisan media, anticipating who we are, what team we're on, and what's important to us, delivering us observations that are going to reinforce that identity. Social media does the same thing. And because this is even more insidious, you have political elites who are anticipating the synergistic dynamics between themselves and partisan media and social media. So these processes become even more amplified because they're all operating by the same rules. The end result is epic, I couldn't think of a better word, epic reinforcement, or the distillation of partisan identity. And the end result is that what we end up getting is messaging that amplifies our social and epistemic identity. So messaging from political elites like Trump aggressively calling for a wall and threatening about the danger of immigrants, Tucker Carlson warning about the dangers of white replacement theory. We have, this is Jesse Waters, literally a whole segment on how conservatives need to return to common sense, right? Common sense is an epistemology that is about gut-guided intuition and instinct. And on the left, what do we get? On the left, what we get is also a coupling of epistemology with political identity. These signs are all over my neighborhood. I live in a very liberal New Jersey neighborhood, and I just want to say, every time you put up a sign like this, what you're doing is you are threatening the social identity of your conservative counterparts and coupling evidence-based ways of coming to truth with what it means to be a good Democrat, and pretty much guaranteeing that Republicans will reject it. So congratulations. This then contributes to what I'm calling identity-driven wrongness rather than misinformation, because I see this as a cycle. It's a dynamic. It is a process, right? Misinformation is not a thing. It is a process. So these are just depressing graphics to start my day. Our belief in the big lie about the election in 2020 linked to Trumpism. And, you know, that one is really intuitive. That makes sense because it benefits Trump and Trump voters. The notion that we have the politicized COVID crisis is really disheartening. And, you know, this graph shows estimated vaccine hesitancy in states, you know, as a function of how the margin that went for Trump in the 2020 election. But now there's additional evidence that this is not just about vaccine hesitancy, but actual death rates from COVID that cluster in the counties that Trump won. And finally, we have identity-driven conspiracy theory beliefs, including replacement theory, which was touted as the sort of reason for the mass shooting that just happened a couple of days ago in Buffalo, where 10 people were killed in a Black neighborhood that the white shooter had identified based on the racial demographics of the neighborhood, looking for the most African-American neighborhood he could find, and went into the grocery store because he feared and was angered by the fact that what he believed was there are people deliberately trying to replace native-born Americans with immigrants who agree with their political views. And if you look at this chart here that comes from the Washington Post, the clustering of these views by media outlet, this is political identity distillation in action. And I recognize I do not have causal order behind these because they go both ways. And I hope that that's clear in the way that I have put this together. And my favorite, the very last thing that we get is pictures like this. This is our friend, Republican Texas Senator Ted Cruz, during the Judge Jackson hearings, scrolling through Twitter, looking for references to his own name, to see to what extent his outburst and his display about racist baby books and critical race theory was being covered and discussed and incentivized and rewarded through social media. So voila. That's it. All right, I went over.
That's fine. We're not very critical regarding time.
Okay, great. So I know that was an awful lot, but my hope is that what you get a sense of is that none of these phenomena is random. They're not random. It's not chaos. It's all very readily explained based on the factors that I've kind of outlined here. So.
Okay, thank you, Dana. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, we have about 25 minutes for questions. For everybody who's joined us online, you can type your questions in the Q&A box and I will read them. And Dana, you can also read along if that's easier. And here in the room, just raise your hand if you have questions while people online are still typing.
Yeah, just a first clarification question, perhaps. Thank you, Dana. Extremely interesting presentation, very vivid, so thank you for that. Just a small clarification question, please. So you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that active open mind thinking associates with reduced conspiracy thinking. Was that right? Could you please break this down for me? Because in my eyes, it could also work the other way around, right? So the more open-minded somebody is, the more open to accept the conspiracy beliefs.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, this was the Brownstein piece that I referred to before. I think, when you look at the actively open-minded thinking, it's not like you're open-minded in the sense that like you'd consider anything. It really is. I did an interview with Gordon Pennycook and David Rand to get their uncensored opinions of what they think is going on here. And Pennycook described actively open-minded thinking as basically like, which do you privilege? Do you privilege the things that you already bring to the table? Or are they the things that are, I hate to use the word Trump, but are they going to trump the strength of incoming information? Or are you constantly on a quest to engage with the world and engage in observations and consider whether or not your pre-existing views need to be updated? So that's sort of how that is characterized. And when you look at the measure itself, it does overlap quite a bit with the underlying constructs of evidence-based motivations and intellectual humility, which is also something that I tackle in the book as a kind of value system that can be used to slow some of these processes. But you're right, just on its face, it sounds like if you are actively open-mindedly thinking, you should be open to the possibility that the moon is made of cheese.
So
right?
am I allowed like a short follow-up? So if I hear this correctly, it's really about the belief updating capacity that we're talking about here, right? So the capacity of people to update their priors on the basis of new observations from experience. Right?
It's not capacity, it's motivation. It's not ability, it's motivation.
All right.
Right?
That answers my
Yeah.
question. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions in the room?
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Danna, for the great presentation. We've had a pretty busy weekend, so it's great to have a good, lively presentation. So I think my question is, I had one sort of more practical question. Is at one point you showed results about the degree of of misinformation about COVID. And if I remember correctly, it showed independents to be in between Democrats and Republicans, right?
Yep. Yeah. Hold on. Let me see. Yeah.
So a priori, I would have thought this to be different, right? Because Democrats and Republicans are both driven to maybe different extents, but they're both driven by these reinforcement mechanisms, and then independents much less so. So, yeah, what is your take on that?
You know, hold on, let me just, hold on, wait, I'm just looking at this here. You want me to bring that back up?
Yeah, thanks, yeah.
Hold on. Oh, wait, now, see, this is when I get confused. Hold on, I'm slow. It's okay. Okay, there's that, well, that's kind of.
Yeah,
tiny, but yeah, okay. So your question is, why does it seem to be that the independents are sort of in between?
Yeah, at least I can't read the labels anymore now, but I had that impression.
Let me see.
So the middle category are the independents, right?
Yeah, so yeah, the striped middle column, these are our independents.
Yeah, so it's mostly for like the graph and the right bottom. There they are. The Democrats are very low, score very low, and the independents are in between, and then the Republicans.
Yeah. You know, the way that I see this actually, this is so interesting. When I had done, so this obviously is just like this would be like a moderation analysis. When I had looked at this too and broken out a little bit differently, it was clear that for independents, if their epistemic motivations make them look more like Republicans, they are more likely to believe in these misperceptions, right? So it's, if they are guided by intuition and emotion, then they are more likely to hold these misperceptions. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, I guess what's tricky about the independents here is that in the US context, even though there is, affective polarization and ideological polarization of elites, the number of people who identify as independent is growing, which suggests that, there are folks who have perhaps liberal policy positions or conservative policy positions, but who do not feel comfortable identifying as a member of the party. And so they kind of cluster in the middle. And so you end up with this kind of weird diluted pool of folks who are this mix in terms of how they engage with the world and the other kinds of epistemic traits they have, right? So their level of tolerance for ambiguity or need for closure.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we do have a question online by Luca Verstegen. Thanks, Danna, for the great talk. To what extent does your argument explain the massive rise in polarization? The only thing that is really new in the last 20 years is social media, which we didn't have until recently. Is that enough? Or what is the trigger that motivates individuals' need for social identity more than in the past?
Yeah, so I would highly recommend Liliana Mason's book, which I feel like I would not have started thinking about these dynamics in the same way without it, because, if you look at the behavior of elites in Washington, D.C. in the 1990s, especially 1994, and the Republican Party under, House Speaker Newt Gingrich really kind of drew a line in the sand and said, I'm going to urge everyone who's running for Congress as a Republican to raise their hand and pledge that they are going to push for all the following policies. And if they don't, we invite voters to vote you out. It was a pledge that basically turned the idea of political compromise into a non-starter. And at that moment, now some of that polarization at the elite level had already started, but 1994 was pivotal because it also triggered a similar movement on the part of Democrats where they're like, screw you, okay, right? And you see this sort of elite ideological entrenchment of how these votes are occurring and the willingness of folks to work across party at the very same time that it is recognized that tapping into identity is a way of fueling these processes. Because as I said, some of that, the racial resentment and the sort of cultural fears and these religious shifts, those date back to the 70s, where there were strategic efforts to recruit folks to the Republican Party based on these beliefs, in part as a backlash against the civil rights movement of the 1960s and this progressive, diversifying move on the part of the Democratic Party. And so what does the civil rights movement do if not activate identity threat for whites, right? Especially culturally conservative whites. So I think you really need to look way, way, way back. And I keep saying, if you had told me that I'd be writing a book about misinformation that wouldn't deal directly with social media or media until like chapters 8 and 9, I would have said, you're bananas, that's crazy. But truly, when you think about what drives our media processes, even social media, right? Which is so, horizontal and feedback loops and interpersonal. The role of pre-existing political and social dynamics, of power dynamics, of racial dynamics and religious dynamics, those I see as, those are the big drivers, right?
Yeah, thanks. We have, there's one question in the room from the place with that.
Thanks. Thank you. I have it's a very interesting model. I have a question that is basically about the extent to which it is context sensitive. I would like to ask to do a thought experiment. So imagine the point where the two parties in the US really started to drift apart, right? Before that time, imagine there was a left-wing populist leader who strongly focused on the lower classes, rural areas, and really expressed a message of populism and also really like looking for self-confirmation. Could you imagine that now, 2022, things would be the other way around, so that there would be the Democrats and the Democratic following being more sensitive to conspiracy theories, for instance, and following of the Republicans being more looking for evidence and for facts?
Yes. Great question. And the answer is yes, if the left-wing populist movement was one that tapped into racial identity and racial threat. If their articulation of the good people, the pure people, was white, then it would flip.
Yeah.
Right? Because when you look like at John Joseph's work on the psychological traits that kind of cluster with political ideology, it is cultural ideology. It's about race, right? And when Donald Trump entered the race in 2015 and came down that golden escalator and gave a speech about how Mexicans are rapists, and then he was going to build a wall, he put immigration on the map and defined that as the dominant pillar of that political identity. And it worked very efficiently, worked very well. But yeah, I don't think that would take much for a liberal populist. The only thing that's tricky, it's hard to imagine that happening like quickly because all of these political beliefs are clustered in these different ways. but I can imagine it.
I mean, a period of, I don't know, 2-3 decades, right?
Yeah.
You have any class with that?
Yeah, my yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Next, we have a question from Tobias Vorbach. He says, super interesting framework. Some people add drops of water in their whiskey to dilute it. With political identity, what ways, if any, do you see to disrupt these reinforcement chains?
Well, and this highlights something that's a bit of a conundrum for me, because distillation of whiskey is great. Distillation of political identity is not. So I would not advocate adding water to your whiskey. However, this is what I'm trying to figure out is, can we create systems? Are there vectors of influence to disrupt this distillation process, to incentivize folks to perform in apolitical ways? And I've been super inspired by the work of Joshua Darr, Joanna Dunaway, and Matt Hitt. They have a book called Homestyle Opinion. They've been doing all this work on the role of local newspapers in diluting partisan identity. Unfortunately, in the United States, local newspapers are dying and being replaced by, partisan online sources. However, if we collectively agreed that we are going to value democratic health, investing in local journalism and investing in public media would be an easy way to start to disrupt these dynamics. Because what happens is, when media organizations are driven by profit, then necessarily they're going to prioritize personality, conflict, fragmented events, and drama. Necessarily, it's going to be efficient for them to tap into partisan mega identities. Necessarily, it's going to be really smart, business for them to tap into culture war issues all the time. Culture war issues all the time. Race, religion, abortion, immigration, all the time. When we have local newspapers that are dealing with local issues and are doing it in a way that's sort of organic, not where you have paid activists who have come in to take over your school board, right? You find that the people in those communities are more likely to identify themselves as members of their communities. Their community identity dilutes, adds water to the whiskey. Their identity as a member of this adorable little town that they live in then reduces the extent to which their partisan identity dominates. That, to me, is super inspiring. Another thing that's super inspiring to me is the concept of intellectual humility, which I mentioned, which is the tendency for people to kind of acknowledge that they might be wrong and be open to the idea of updating their beliefs. So it's a little bit like the actively open-minded thinking, but there's an affective component that I find really compelling. Intellectual humility is about how I feel about myself vis-a-vis other sources of knowledge. It's like, I know I don't know everything, and I want to know more. That's intellectual humility. Our current partisan media environment and our political media environment do not incentivize the performance of intellectual humility. In fact, it is punished. If you say, you know what, I'm actually going to change my view on that, I'm going to change my position because of new information, that is penalized. You are not going to get on television on one of these shows if you are like, here's kind of what I have been thinking, but I'm open to other ideas. What do you think, Tucker? Right? That does not make for good television. So the question is, though, how can we create spaces where that is modeled and that is performed? From my vantage point, the one place where we see elites performing intellectual humility, unfortunately, is science. And what is happening to Dr. Anthony Fauci every time he performs it? He's called a liar because he changed his mind. He's called incompetent because he says that things are different than they were 2 weeks ago. So we cannot allow science to be the only domain where intellectual humility is performed on the regular, right? Like that can't be a thing. I could go on for hours. You need to stop me.
We do have another question in the room.
Yeah, hi Dana, thank you for your
Hi.
talk. I thought
Sure.
it was really interesting. My question is about your explanation of epistemic identities and how the epistemic identity of the Republican Party is to make more gut-based intuitive decisions, as I understand.
Yep.
Just from the news, just from American news and my perception of it, it seems to me that there's a subgroup of Republicans who believe that they're actually acting, that they're protecting Americans because they're making very evidence-based, hard economic decisions, and that they're making the decisions that the liberals don't want to make, or the Democrats don't want to make, because they want to protect people's feelings. And I'm wondering whether you would place these with the independents, or how you would sort them, and yeah, basically.
That's a great question. It kind of, I thought you were going to take it in a little bit of a different direction at one point, because there's also the issue, related issue, where conservatives, especially far right wing conservatives, they say that they want evidence. They say they need to do their own research, right? To figure out if vaccines are safe, for example. I need to do my own research. But what they're describing, the actual process that they're describing, is a process that is completely deductive and not inductive. It is completely driven by their looking for what they want to find, right? Or finding what they want to look for. When you talk about the economic piece, that's really interesting. I think that is something that you hear, the notion that, we here on the political right, we're the ones who are pursuing truth, as opposed to on the left, they're concerned about offending people. And we're the ones who are actually pursuing truth, because we're not worried about who's going to be offended. That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I need to think about that. Can you say more? You talked about it with the economic piece. What did you mean about with economics?
I mean, I think I hear a lot of, on Fox News, for example, or even if you watch Ben Shapiro's videos, a lot of his ideas are about protecting, so justifying his views on economic policies and then I guess the argument is that because that distribution and more welfare-based policies are feelings-based, or that they're trying to protect the feelings of people, and whereas other ones that just maximize the GDP or are more about numbers are like the evidence-based hard truth ones. And
that's interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna have to think on that one and get back to you, because I think you're right. I think that is how they see it. I think you're right. I don't know. I still feel like if you administered some of these scales to the individuals who say those things, I still think that you would find that they are actually more likely to be guided by intuition. Although I could be wrong. But remember too, now the fiscal policy is really kind of a tricky thing, because the relationships that we're really talking about, they don't hold when you just look at economic or fiscal ideology. They're really about social and cultural ideology. So it's probably a lot messier if you look at the relationship between these different epistemic motivations and liberal and conservative in terms of fiscal policy. I think it would be, from what I understand and what I've read, those relationships would not be as strong.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's time to round up. Thanks a lot, Danna. This is really a very interesting talk and very inspiring, I think, for all of us in the room. When we ever get to see each, are you getting to ICA, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, then
I mean, truly, like, God willing. I mean, I'm wearing my N95 mask like everywhere because I'm like, I'm going to Paris.
and you don't want to test negative before you board the plane. Yeah, I've been there a few weeks ago when I was going to Chicago. Then next week we'll get you your Hot Politics Lab coffee mug as a little thank you for presenting.
Wonderful. That sounds great.
Let me quickly announce the remainder of the schedule for this year, or this academic year. So next week, most of us will be in Paris to attend the ICA session. Really looking forward to that, and for any of the people online joining us today, if you would be interested in meeting us, just let me know, or someone else, and we can set up a meeting. Would be really great. So next week, no meeting. The week after that, June 1st, we have Arvid Kappas from Jacobs University in Bremen, who will give a talk that is titled, "Oh, Emotion, You Wondrous Thing." I'm really looking forward to that one. Hans van der Maas also will give a talk the week after that, June 10th. Also has a very poetic title, namely Cascading Transitions in Psychosocial Systems. To me, that sounds like a song that was, I don't know, came out in the 1990s by the Prodigy or Massive Attack or something. 17th of June, Flavio Azevedo will give a talk, Measuring Ideology, Current Practices, Its Consequences and Recommendations. And then the last meeting of this year already, June 24th, there will be, it's a graduate Friday session with 2 presentations, one by Christian people. They all sound the same. Rhetoric change and influence in parliamentary speeches, and Luca Versteeg from Gothenburg University with his talk is titled Exclusion at the Center, Theory of Populist Radical Right Voters, Position in Society, as always, between 3 and 4 Central European time at this very link, and hopefully next time again in our regular room, if you want to join us there, the common room at the Political Science Department. For now, thank you all for attending and hope to see you maybe in Paris, otherwise in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your great questions.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.